hope you're doing well. It's a beautiful day here. We are in California now, not in our final home, so we're kind of just renting an apartment near where my in-laws live. Today I'm still drinking that Mexican coffee in my really fancy glasses. You can kind of see how it's got these weird little ridges on it so that it swirls more to get more of the aromatics out. Today we're going to talk about something a little different. We're going to talk about award nominees and winners, because over this past year, I've spent more time in being intentional about picking up and reading award-winning books or award nominees. Whenever I was younger, I used to regularly pick up Hugo Award winners or Hugo nominated books. I kind of fell off from that for a while, partially because of some of the issues that were going on with the Hugo Awards. There was a lot of drama around them. There was the sad puppy debacle of the mid 2010s, which is a bunch of right-wing reactionaries trying to get a whole bunch of right-wing books in and try to stop anybody with, diversity. It was very much a part of Gamergate. But I've decided to kind of branch out a little bit into more or broader section. So I've picked up, the Ursula K. Le Guin, which is certainly a speculative fiction type book award, the Booker Prize, which is much more literary, and I also picked up a Pulitzer Prize winning book. So, I think that it's interesting to see what, especially because it's so far away from where I normally read, I think it's interesting to dive into these sorts of books and see what the literary world is thinking that is important or that is good. So I picked up one book that was a shortlist. I think it was for the Booker Prize, but it did win winner of the Nordic Council Literary Prize. So this book is called On the Calculation of Volume, Book 1. Yeah, it was shortlisted for the 2025 International Booker Prize, which honestly is a really weird fucking name. It doesn't really, make sense from a perspective of what the book is. The book itself is kind of a Groundhog Day book, where the main character experiences the exact same day over and over and over and over again. And for her, she's a middle-aged woman who is a book retailer. Like, she goes and finds rare books and works with her husband to ship them out and sell them. They live in France, a small town in France. And for her first, November the 18th, she is in Paris and, spends one of the days there. But we start following her on the 120th day of her of her November 18th. And I think what the name really means is that throughout this book, you can kind of say that she is exploring the volume of her life, the volume of the lives around her, the volume of her husband's existence, the limitations of the rules of the Groundhog Day in this world, and then also the way that people can shrink themselves down in their lives if they're not happy. Because I would almost argue in some ways that this is a woman going through a traumatic event and then shrinking herself down as small as she possibly can to her life living in the spaces between when her husband is moving around the house in this one single spare bedroom they have, where she has to sneak around. She's not really existing anymore beyond what is missing at the shops around her house. I think that it's a really interesting study of how a person's life can have these ups and downs over the span of the year, and how people can change, and how those can drive how someone deciding that they want to go look at the stars can start the possibility of them expanding again beyond just being this shrunken being. In some ways, it could also be that the husband in the world around her is experiencing a type of dementia because she remembers everything. She remembers all these other versions of this, but she has to re-explain everything to her husband. And every time it is like another wound to her. And, it's interesting because the author actually explores all the things that people generally talk about trying in the books, or in these sorts of things, the Groundhog Day thing, like where does it transition? And what happens in this book that's different than like the movie Groundhog Day is that she can stay up and she can just continue going and going, but there will be a time when her husband isn't paying attention and the world resets at that time. And it can happen throughout the time, and he will be up, but he'll be, like, it'll be like the next day at 8 a.m, and he'll suddenly like, what the hell is going on? Why aren't you in Paris? Sort of thing. And he gets angry about this, which I definitely think is a representation of dementia, because you never know whenever it's going to happen. And I think that there's certainly a lot of nuances for the character being a woman that I'm overlooking. The things that she has to consider and navigate. Her own hygienic needs, her own dietary needs, and things like that. She has to consider. Her own. The way she looks at herself, the way she sees herself being dressed, and how that kind of interacts with her mood and where she is in her expansion or contraction of herself. And I've also picked up a couple other award nominees, like Rake's Fall, which I did a video about here, and I did. Actually, I guess it would be over here. And I did another one of The Blackheart Man, which was here. And then I picked up Shroud and Alien Clay, both by Adrian Tchaikovsky, because I like Tchaikovsky. But as I was going through and looking at these books, I saw that they'd been up for awards, and so I inadvertently picked up additional award nominees. And then I had picked up Orbital because I wanted to try to see what the Booker Mann Award winning was, which was actually up against the calculation of volume. And I really do see the similarities in a lot of ways between Orbital and Volume, in that there's a recurrence and sameness that the characters are going through. And I think that these books are intended to feel like they're definitely not traditional storytelling mechanisms, which, whenever, considering I read a lot of sci-fi and fantasy, which always has a very strong narrative arc, these, the Booker Prize books don't have that as strongly. You can find it, but it's not really there the same way as like Shroud, where they go find this alien planet that they crash land onto, and then they have to figure out how to save themselves on this very alien antagonistic environment. But it still feels like a pretty standard, travel from here to there type book, which isn't an uncommon book type. Alien Clay kind of feels like the same sort of thing, but there's a lot more unique elements to that, which I talked about in this video here. But Tchaikovsky just continues to be the best at creating novel alien life, very interesting environments, and just strange things that really challenge what it means to be alive and how we interact with alive things. On the other hand, Rake's Fall and Blackheart Man really felt different for me, or unfamiliar to me, because a lot of these books are really rooted in the cultures that I think that they're representing. So a lot of fantasy is very clearly written after European medieval. And these books are written at either a, well, like Rakesfall kind of spans a period of time where it goes pre-colonial to colonial to post-colonial to the future. In Sri Lanka, which has a whole suite of beliefs that I knew nothing about. I still really don't know anything about them. And Blackheart Man is a Caribbean culture that kind of takes place clearly after the introduction of the slave trade, kind of moving forward from there. So there's like an element of colonialism in it, and a little bit of post-colonialism is in that it's like a country like Haiti that is independent of that. I mean, but even though orbital and calculation of volume were kind of different in their structure, they were very easy to understand in terms of what was going on or how the people were thinking, because they were either American point of views or European point of views, and there wasn't really nothing too strange about that. It was just, reading about somebody on the space station or reading about someone who loves books that does some traveling in Europe. And it's a crappy, rainy day. And sometimes whenever it's a rainy ass day, it just feels like the same day every day all over again. And as I was thinking about the fact that I picked up these other books, I decided that as I was, putting together this episode, I got to this point and said, you know what, I want to go out and pick up James, because I've been seeing it all over the place. It's won Pulitzer Prize. It's been really pushed in a lot of places. It has a very kind of generic book cover. If you see it from a distance, it's just like a gigantic J and then little James. But if you look closely, there's a man in the little upper part of the J, or I guess, upper part of the J here, with a little rucksack that he's carrying. This book actually helped me see some sort of through line with these award-winning books that I hadn't seen before, which I'll get to a little bit later. But this book was fantastic. I was completely blown away by this book. I was not expecting it. I didn't really know what I was getting into when I read the book. I didn't really know what the book was. And within the first couple of sentences, I said to myself, this wasn't written by a white guy. There's no way it could have been written by a white person. Just the tone, the way that language is being used, the comfort in the way of describing the main character himself, James, and then the kids that are around him who are clearly white. At that point I figured out exactly who it was, because it was, he mentions Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. So this is James from Huck Finn. I'd never heard of Percival Everett, which is not surprising. Considering I read sci-fi fantasy and not in like tech policy or tech adjacent type nonfiction. I don't read a ton of traditional literary fiction, which this clearly is. I mean, he's got a whole boatload of awards. So, maybe I'll read more of his work in the future, because I really liked this book. I believe that the through line with these books is that the books really focus on a lot of character growth that kind of happens in a non-traditional way that leads to very interesting character development. And I would argue that for most of the characters that are in these books, they're radically different towards the end. I think Orbital is still a little bit of an outlier on this, but the woman who starts the beginning of on calculation of volume is radically different than who she becomes at the very end of it. And James is incredibly different. And I also love the way he's portrayed in this. I plan on doing another video after this about about James and Grendel. So we'll get into it a little bit more. He was an enslaved man. He was willing to put up with things, and by the end goes so far as being able to confront his master and like really call out the injustices of the South. I think that the book is actually written by James himself, even though he wrote it in a third person, which makes it an interesting story. In volume, like I said, the main character goes through significant changes. Like initially, she finds herself almost codependent on her husband, and then goes into this significant period of depression, and then delves into who she is, and almost goes through a self-discovery journey, and then breaks away and redefines herself, where she doesn't even need her husband anymore. The unique circumstances of the books translate into the general punch of these personal development. James was uniquely impactful and punched well above its length. It was a very short book. 200 some pages. And I think these types of character developments allowed people to relate to these different contexts in different ways, because we all change or grow, and depending on where you are in your life, these characters can represent you in different ways. James's character growth with Huck and Toe allows anybody to be able to empathize with an enslaved man in the mid 1800s. And this kind of goes for Blackheart Man and Rakesfall. You really identify with the main, like with the troublemaker in Blackheart Man. I think for the most part, you kind of can follow along and empathize with the characters in Rakesfall until kind of the sci-fi section, which kind of is way out there. But because they're built on actual cultures, I think it helps us understand those cultures a little bit better than we would have otherwise. They knew nothing about Sri Lankan culture before. And again, like I said, Orbital is the only outlier. The characters are rather stagnant, and it was more of an exploration of the beauty of Earth through eyes of archetypes instead of real people. And I think that it was the weakest book in this series, in this group I read, honestly. If you want more on my thoughts, check out my book with my episode where I talk about Orbital and Project Hail Mary. Of these award nominees or winners that I've read this year, James is just heads and shoulders above the rest. My timing reading the book was somewhat coincidental. I wrapped up reading it as I was watching a Christmas special, Behind the Bastards, which was about ending the slave trade in the British Empire. And James actually referenced one of the books they discussed in the podcast, which I got more context about that book, which was the adventures, the narration of a former enslaved man, and which actually kind of inspired James to write a book, and also in real life inspired Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass, went on to inspire some of the other people who ended the slave trade in Spain, or not in Spain, in Britain. And it really felt just good. I really recommend watching that video. I'll link it here. It's a 3 or 4 part series. It is a pretty dark series, but it's the slave trade. That's going to happen. As I said, I plan on discussing James in a future video. And the thing that I really like about James is the way that he's recontextualized. I might go on to reread Huck Finn as well. Let me know if you'd find it interesting for me to do a comparison of some different scenes between how they're portrayed in James and how the same scene is portrayed in Huck Finn. So I hope you like what I've put together here. Give me a like and a subscribe. Let me know if there's an award-winning book down below that you want me to read or think that I should read, or if you think that I'm just way off base on all these books and that I'm an idiot. Really appreciate your comments. Please give me a like. And I really appreciate your time. I know that you could be doing a lot of other things and watching other people's videos. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a good one.